Folkens, velkommen til en ny sesjon på denne her ekstremt populære økonomifestivalen på KK. Der er kø ut alle dørene, og da synes jeg det er greit å minne om sånne trivielle ting som nødutganger og så videre, siden det er så fullt her. Der er en der, og så er det den døren dere kom inn. Ellers er det å si at vi er nesten på tida, skal prøve å holde programmet sånn at folk kommer seg videre på det de har tenkt seg ut på. Og nå skal jeg snart switche til engelsk, fordi at to av deltakerne i panelet ikke er så gode i norsk. Steve Keen was here also yesterday for the festival and has had his little clash already with the other professor in the panel, Kalle Moene. Very interesting. I silently hope that they will continue in the same vein today. Also, Steve Keen, for those of you who don't know him, is a professor of economics at Kingston University, in London, and he's described himself as sort of an anti-economist, in the sense that he is opposed to many of the prevailing ideas or theories in modern day economics. He's also written a book about that called Debunking Economics. He also has another claim to fame, of course, that many of you know, that he was one of the few people who predicted the financial crisis in 2007-2008. Cahal Moran is also an economist. He's not got his PhD yet, but he's getting there, I've been told. He has been a very important player in a project called Rethinking Economics, which also started at his alma mater in Manchester University, a sort of rebellion against the prevailing theories on economic development and financial theories, especially in the light of, or on the background that many economists were not able to predict or foresee what happened when the financial market collapsed about 10 years ago. So he has been a very strong advocate for rethinking economics and trying to make economics more actual and better equipped to address the actual challenges that we are facing in the world today. Kalle Moene, I think for many of you, is a more well-known figure. He's, of course, a professor of economics in Oslo. And I'm happy to note that he quite recently got Norsk Forskningsråds formidlingspris for his ability to explain complex economic questions or theories in a very understandable way. That's highly reassuring to me, at least. This event will be a sort of a three-segment thing. To start it off, Cahal and Steve will discuss the book, Debunking Economics. After that, I hope that Professor Moene will have some comments, and gradually we'll take it into discussing the debt situation in the world today. So, let's start. Cahal, okay. Get to it.
Yeah. Okay, so let's start with the basics then. So when you say debunking economics, what do you mean by debunking?
It's full of mathematical nonsense, fundamentally. It's a theory which asked a legitimate question about 150 years ago, and that is, can a set of markets reach equilibrium without any coordinating force to bring them together, just by the actions on an individual market? And in some ways, that was Walras who did that back in the 1870s. And what he was doing is effectively trying to operationalise the idea of the invisible hand, which of course was Smith's classic cliche that he actually wasn't describing markets with when he used it both times, but nonetheless, economists latched onto this idea of an invisible hand bringing about a situation of general benefit to everybody, even if everybody's trying to get their own individual gain, this outcome is socially optimal. And Walras failed at that. He mathematically failed. He didn't know he'd mathematically failed because he didn't have enough mathematics to understand it. But he wrote the model. He asked the world's leading mathematician at the time, verified, who was a guy called Poincaré. Poincaré refused because he said, I can't be sure your process will reach equilibrium. And about 20 years later, by sheer accident, not done deliberately, a group of mathematicians called Moran and Frobenius proved that the process that Walras thought would reach equilibrium did not reach equilibrium. Now, rather than saying, oh dear, just like Pythagoreans used to think all numbers could be described as ratios of integers, and finding there were things which were rational numbers, and saying after they drowned the guy who first discovered it, thinking maybe we better actually take these into account, and then we get irrational numbers and complex numbers and the huge improvement in mathematics and engineering and physics and so on out of all that. Economists have said, let's pretend we got there anyway, frankly. And most of them don't even know they've done that. Most of them don't know things like the Moran-Frobenius theorem. And consequently, there's a whole series of what I call not mathematics, but mythematics to economics. And I decided to go through methodically all the ones that I knew. I added one or two of my own, which I didn't expect to do when I wrote the book. But that's saying these are all the various theoretical critiques which have been made, sometimes by neoclassicals themselves, frequently by critics. Put them all together, and you could debunk the lot, and we should restart.
Okay, yeah, so that's interesting, because one of the themes of your book is that a lot of what you're saying is not new. No. It's been around for a very long time. So could you maybe give us an example of one of these critiques, and also discuss how the mainstream seems to be able to resist or ignore these critiques for such a long period of time?
Any victims of an economics degree here for the moment, or post? Okay, a few. Okay.
Victims.
One of the major components of the theory is the argument, effectively, that capitalism is meritocratic. And part of that comes from saying we get paid what economists call our marginal product. And that says that the wage is equal to the additional amount of production produced by the last worker to be hired. The rate of return of capital, the profit rate, is equal to the contribution to production made by the last machine installed. And therefore, there's fairness. You get what you provide. Back in 1926, an economist called Piero Sraffa targeted that in one particular way. He spent 34 years writing a critique he called the production of commodities by means of commodities. And in that, he showed mathematically that this had the one problem in this theorem was that how do you add up capital? Because it's easy to add labour. How many hours we each do as unskilled labour is fairly easy to add. Adding one machine to another is not straightforward. How do I add this machine, the computer, to that machine, a recorder, and this one a camera? I've got to use their prices, but their prices then, of course, include, effectively, the rate of profit they're earning. So there's a circularity. And what Sraffa did in a very complicated piece of work was show that rather than the rate of profit, depending upon the amount of capital, whatever rate of profit you had determined how much capital you thought you had. And therefore, you couldn't have a marginal productivity theory of income distribution. Now, that was a battle between, in fact, it was actually fought as an intellectual battle between Cambridge in the UK and Cambridge, Massachusetts, mainly Massachusetts Institute of Technology. So it's called the Cambridge Controversies. And I think you've all heard the name Paul Samuelson. Okay. Most neoclassicals think they won that debate. Paul Samuelson wrote a summing up at one point, and he said that basically the other side won. And that he said, if this makes us all nostalgic for the old parables of neoclassical economics, economists have to learn that they weren't born to live an easy life. In other words, the main protagonist on the neoclassical side gave up, said, yes, you're right, the theory doesn't work, but how many have done a course recently and learned the marginal productivity theory of income distribution? It didn't even turn up in the textbooks. Okay? So that sort of thing has happened all the way through, and in that sense I see economics education is frankly mendacious. It's so mendacious that some of the people teaching it don't know they're lying, okay? Because they don't know the literature that contradicts the theories they're putting forward. So that's one of the classics, and there's many, many others. One of my favourite is actually an own goal. I know Norway's a pretty good soccer country, so I can use that.
That's a low blow.
Sorry. But one of the things, you know the idea of a downward sloping demand curve. Essential part of all microeconomic instruction and so on. That's derived using a theory about individual preferences and the budget constraints facing a single individual. And they can derive what they call a Hicksian compensated downward sloping demand curve. It must slope down for every commodity. The question was then posed by the neoclassicals, quite a legitimate question. If we add everybody up, do we still get a downward sloping market demand curve? And ordinarily people think, oh yes, you just add them horizontally, no problem. But if you're changing prices you're also changing incomes. And one essential part of the model that you use in your micro theory is there's a pivot point, which is where the income is on the vertical axis. That doesn't change because they change the price, your income doesn't change. But of course, when you actually do it with multiple people, when you change prices, you do change incomes, so that pivot point moves. And therefore, the point of tangency you get that you're adding up for all of your people moves around as well. And they mathematically proved that the demand curve of the market, even if you're adding up individuals who all conform to what they call the law of demand, the market demand curve you get out of that can have any shape you can draw using a polynomial, which means anything that wiggles doesn't intersect itself and doesn't give two values for one input. Any line that does that is a legitimate market demand curve. Now, do they teach that? If you read the most advanced textbook by a guy called Cahal, you'll find on page about 850, 20-page discussion of that result called Anything Goes. Most economists haven't read that section, don't teach it, and even Cahal ignores the impact of the result. What it says is you can't do supply and demand analysis. Now, are you taught that in economics courses? No, you're not. So that's the sort of thing I was debunking.
So I'm curious as to how Cahal can discuss this outright and then go on to just completely ignore it. Does nobody notice? I don't understand.
I find it ridiculous as well, because I expected when I got a copy of Cahal, I mean, it's so big you can use it as an anchor for some of the ships in the harbour out there. So, of course, people want to teach out of it, they're not going to use the entire book. And I expected not to find this thing discussed, so I was quite impressed to find it was in there. The chapter's called Anything Goes. You know? But then the end of the technical questions he set, and virtually every economics course on the planet, except ones that I'm involved in, and you guys want to design, a series of mathematical exercises solve this conundrum. And what it did was, under what conditions can you derive a downward sloping market demand curve? With the results of that, that's what was actually applied, rather than saying we've got to throw it all out and find a different way to explain where demand comes from. Now, the simple explanation is that this conventional theory has an isolated individual, no mention of social class, no mention of their relative income. But when you add people together, relative incomes matter. So what you can say objectively, in the empirical world, there will be, probably, if you try to draw them, downward sloping market demand curves. The reason is, as things get more expensive, the poor can't afford them, and vice versa. So there's an income distribution explanation of what we see in the real world that neoclassical theory itself cannot generate, because it leaves out the whole issue of income distribution in its definition of its fundamental problems.
So, I mean, I'm hearing from you that basically economics textbooks are quite focused on a solution that they want to get to, whether it's a downward sloping demand curve or being able to measure capital. And then any assumption is made quite slyly and disregarded on the way to that solution.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. I don't know how many are actually realising they're being sly. I think what happens in a lot of cases is people think, oh, well, I don't know this literature well enough, I'm not mathematically gifted enough to do it myself, but I assume the experts got it right, so I assume I can do it. Now, in fact, you read the experts, they find that they proved the opposite of what people wish to believe. But that doesn't stop them continuing. So with Cahal, it's quite a remarkable mental, to admit the problem, but then not manifest it. And there's something, I think, dyslectic, there's something, what was the term you guys used to use, autistic, or was that the French students?
No, that was the French students. That
about
was
the nature of economics.
We don't do that anymore.
Yeah, well, I know you don't anymore, but it's a capacity to divide things up in a way that doesn't work in the real world.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, I guess it's just too confusing, really, isn't it? It's confusing for everybody involved, and I think students are probably too confused to question it as well, because they're too busy trying to learn to regurgitate the maths and to do this proof and that proof, so they can't really engage critically. Do you think it's sort of the maths acts as a barrier?
It shouldn't, because the maths itself, neoclassical mathematics is really, really cool stuff if I'm giving this talk in 1897, let's say. Because from 1899 on, we just started developing the mathematics of complex systems. That was one of Poincaré's major contributions, was to prove the orbits of the planets are chaotic, done in 1899. And then since then, since the mid-1960s, mathematicians have developed mathematics for analysing complex systems. And the interesting thing about complex systems is people think complex means complicated, lots of moving parts, really hard to understand. It doesn't. what they found was very simple systems could have complex dynamics because of nonlinear interactions. Those nonlinear interactions don't turn up if your models are fundamentally linear. And most of the models that neoclassicals have built are linear models. Add something to something else. If you make something input 10 times as large, it has 10 times the impact. Make it 100 times as large, 100 times the impact. But the real world, there's nothing linear in the real world. Nothing. If a road was linear, it would reach Jupiter. Okay? Everything's non-linear. So when you have non-linearity in there, make something 10 times as large, maybe 10 times the impact, make it 100 times as large, 1,000,000 times the impact. And then what you get out of that is complex cycles, which I brought my computer along to demonstrate if anybody wants to see some instances of that. So economics could be built in the same way, and it actually involves sophisticated mathematics, but fundamentally it's much less complicated than what the neoclassicals have done. So the really, really hard work you've got to do to build the very first, what's called dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model, it takes you, if you sat down and scratch and try to build a model using the approach they have from the logical foundation they start from with the mathematics, you might take about 2 or 3 days as a skilled mathematician to write the thing up. I wrote the model that I built the Minsky thing out of in 5 minutes. And it's just because the non-linear approach is just much more realistic.
It's excessively complicated what mainstream economists do for the results that they want to get.
Yeah.
Whereas what you're saying is you can have actually some relatively simple starting points, which you use in your models, and get some quite interesting dynamic behaviour out of it.
And that's why I've pretty much described neoclassical economics as Ptolemaic economics. Because if you imagine you're trying to build a model of the behaviour of the planets and the stars and Earth and Sun and Moon, on the presumption that the Earth is the centre of the universe and everything rotates it around on circles, that gets really complicated because, first of all, you've got to say, well, there are these things called planets. The Greek word planet actually is Greek for wanderer because they reverse direction in the sky if you look at them. Because what they're doing, we know what they're doing. They're spinning around the Earth at the Sun at a different speed to what we're doing. But imagine trying to reinterpret that as them spinning around the Earth. So you've got to put a circle on the circles. And then that's not good enough because the orbits are actually elliptical. So what you've got to do is say the Earth's not quite the centre of the universe, it's slightly off the centre, and that's the point of rotation. And there's another fourth complication. It's really hard. And what you, as a Ptolemaic astronomer, what you'd do is you'd make your own set of tables and your own set of circles, and you'd be comparing it to somebody else's, little tweaks and stuff like that. Really, really hard work. Then along comes this bastard called Kepler, who says it's just a case of the arcs that are swept out around an ellipse. And I've forgotten the actual name of the law, but it's the equal areas law. And Galileo saying the Earth is the sun is the centre, not the Earth. And then you get Newton coming out with the inverse square law. Now that's incredibly sophisticated mathematics to get to the point of doing it, but bloody simple by comparison to all the circles on circles on circles that are necessary to give you the Ptolemaic model. So I think a lot of reasons why economists, neoclassicals, react badly to how I express myself is I'm saying you're working far too bloody hard. Okay? You don't need to do all this complicated stuff. Go back to a decent foundation and you can build this stuff initially quite simply and capture elements of the real world you don't understand. And then as we build it, we'll get more sophisticated models that be a closer fit to the real world, but qualitatively, we'll capture the real world much more effectively by throwing out what you guys do and starting from the opposite direction.
I think that we have to move on now in the program a little bit.
Sorry about that.
But because I think you have already managed to introduce some slightly provocative statements. And one question that I have is that instead of saying, like Mr. Greenspan did famously, that he didn't see it coming when he commented on the financial crisis, he didn't see it, you are saying that if he had just paid attention, he should have, right? And it's even in textbooks now.
Yeah.
The methods you can use to detect it and possibly also avoid it. And there is a kind of a significant difference between being ignorant and being willfully, misleading.
It wasn't willful at all. I mean, I know lots of economists. Some neoclassical economists are some of my best friends. I'm not knocking them as people at all. They sincerely believe they're making the world a better place by reforming it to look like an economics textbook. And they sincerely believe they understand, they did sincerely believe they understood how capitalism behaved. And in 2007, using their models, they predicted 2008 was going to be a cracker of a year. Not quite the sort of cracker they expected turned up. So that's it's sincerity to what they're doing, but what they do is, part of what their theory ends up getting to do is say, these are things you don't need to worry about. Now, one of the things that you don't need to worry about is the level of private debt and its rate of change. Coming from my direction, those are two of the most essential things you need to worry about. So by looking at those two things, I said, okay, qualitatively, I saw not just a crisis coming in the future, but if it did occur, it would be preceded by what you might call a great moderation. So I did that work back in 1992. And then in 2006, looking at the data, I saw this exponential increase in private debt and said it can't be sustained. When it slows down, there'll be a crisis. Now, from a neoclassical point of view, when it slows down, the economy doesn't give a shit. One person's asset, another person's liability, debt falls, debt rises, no particular effect on the economy. Let's ignore it, even though we collect the data, which is what they did.
Professor Moene, how do you react to this critique?
First of all, I said we are going to be debate, so you are very harsh towards everybody else, and then you have to tolerate that we try to be in a modest way critical back. I think it is it's something of sociological interest here. All the guys that I admire in economics are never as self-congratulations as some of the critiques are. That they are very certain that they have got it right, and all the others are stupid, dumb, and they use their talent really in the wrong way. People that I know, some of them will call themselves neoclassical, they're much more humbled. And they are sort of much more interested in finding out things. They do mistakes and they correct it. And this self-gratulating tone, I think, is wrong. I think it also, I will place it back to you. You are a very critical person. Why are you so uncritical to him? Why shouldn't he be criticized?
It was the next question.
Okay. I think wait 2 seconds. I think this is what progress are. Progress are that there are friction, that people try out an idea and there are friction. People say, oh no, it can't be like that. But it's just this, that you put people into camps. I don't know who they are. I guess I'm a one of they, I guess, but I don't recognize, I don't find neither my research nor my teaching to fit what you're saying. And you always say that, then they, the neoclassical economists, and those people I clap my hands for, yeah, not like that either. But I can each of the things that you say, I think we can understand, and these Cambridge controversies, there can be different opinions about that, how deep this investigation was. For example, this SAFA model that was the basis for the debate, that he was very uncertain himself whether he should really publish it. He was working in the library in Cambridge, and he was working on Ricardo's collected works. So, on the side, he worked on this thing. But that model, I was a student at that time, I began as a student when this debate was high up. Then we saw that this was very much like a model they used in the Bureau of Statistics, one of the places that's very controversial these days. It was called PRIM model, and it was based on an input-output. It wasn't so advanced as this, but it was very much similar to that. For students in Oslo at that time, it was what's new? I've seen it before, and it was something with this atmosphere, or this very general critique, or something that I think was very simple and not so sophisticated as many other people thought. I thought it was a good book, and it was solving a problem I've discussed in Ricardo's principle, and he took it up and solved it. And then I think it was built upon this some sort of ideology that this was basically critique of capitalism, that I didn't find so much interesting as I thought many of the other things that sort of considered the social conflicts, model the social conflicts, model the how people have divergent interests and so on, and try to do that. Made mistakes and when people interact, and not this very grandiose them and us, and it's not the way progress are happening in science, I think.
But
if I can comment on that.
Just a second. But as a layman, I'm not an economist. I'm just interested, right? I'm looking at this, and I'm seeing a sort of what I think they call a paradigm shift, right? There is a theory and there's a conflicting theory, and those two can't be reconciled in a way. So you have to choose between one or the other. And okay, now it's gloves off. And I was thinking about the theory of equilibrium.
For any mistake, one gloves goes off. Okay, so that was one.
That's going to make it very interesting.
Okay.
But I was thinking, Professor Keynes, one of his main points of contention is that there is no equilibrium in this system. And that's sort of a yes or no question. Do you agree or disagree? Or is it not like that?
But it's too general statement. I think there is a way too general statement. But I think these things, it's easy to understand, and they are specific. For example, when I was a student, we had Trygve was a teacher. So he taught us the limitations of general equilibrium theory. And it was just things we got for the exam. But he is saying they never understood these things. For example, I'll give you an example. What does the demand curve say if you really take it really seriously? And what does it say? It says till this price, consumers, if they take that price as given, they will buy so and so much. And you alter the price, you reduce the price, and according to the theory, the demand will fall. And then you say, yeah, shut up.
2 times. 2 times.
And then I said, this is on the basis of the logic of the model. And so take then the supply. I said, give a price. This is how much you will supply for a given price. And you reduce the price or increase the price, then the supply go up. So then you ask, so what is an equilibrium? Well, there's only one point you can ever observe, because there's only one point where both sides can have right. And that is exactly where these intersect. So there can't be, and he's right, there can't be a theory of a process of reaching that. And so this was well clearly discussed by, I guess in his words, Hovelmo will be they, and so he is stupid and all that. But they were smart people, and they understood it. Nothing new under the sun.
Professor Keen, have you been too rash in your assessment of your...
No, because, I mean, the first chapter of the book is called... thank you. The first chapter of the book is called No More Mr. Nice Guy. The reason being that if I wanted to trace my own intellectual lineage back, it would start a long way before Marx, but in terms of the most recent critiques, it'd start with Veblen. And Veblen, Thorstein Veblen, I think he's actually Norwegian, isn't he? Yeah. Okay, there you go. That makes up for my soccer jibe. Thorstein Veblen wrote a paper in 1898 called Why is Economics Not an Evolutionary Science? And what he argued was there's a taxonomic approach in economics, classifying this as monopoly, this is competition, this is imperfect competition, this is oligopoly, rather than saying what's the dynamic process that determines the structure of an industry? And what's the evolutionary process that causes products to change over time? So the questions that neoclassical set, which were legitimate questions, it's an interesting point in starting how you analyse capitalism, but it results in a set of answers that A, they failed to reach the conclusions they wanted to reach. I'm going to say they. And most of them aren't aware they haven't reached them. And on the other hand, there are alternative paradigms, and very much the important term, which are incommensurable. So you cannot take one from the other. Again, that's why I use the example of
choose.
Astronomy. You've got to choose. Is the Earth the centre of the universe, or is the Sun the centre of the solar system? You've got a choice. What can you take from one theory to the other? Nothing. Okay? So that's... And the thing is, having had 80 or 100 years of... more than 120 years of that debate, we continue being ignored. They continue teaching the same thing. They fall back to the same micro foundations built up from micro, presume equilibrium is stable, and we can handle unstable equilibria systems in modern sciences all across the planet, except in economics. And so I said, look, I'm just sick of it. I'm just going to be polite anymore.
Cahal, I feel bad for cutting you short and depriving you of the chance to ask a critical question of Professor Keane. So now it's your turn to do that.
Okay, well.
Now checking whether he's actually making it up.
Yeah, okay, right. Well, it's sort of similar to what you said, but defenders of mainstream economics will say your criticisms are quite outdated. There are new developments in economics. There's things like behavioral economics. We've moved past rationality. We've moved past these sort of basic core models that you criticize. So what's your response to that?
Fundamentally, that it is a very slippery school to tie down because, for example, I've just written a review as part of a festschrift for an economist called Johannes Korn of his book called Anti-Equilibrium, which he wrote back in 1971. And what he was critiquing then, what he called equal equilibrium models. Only they weren't what they now call dynamic stochastic general equilibrium. Back then they were computable general equilibrium. And they were input-output models that looked at production at a point in time and worked out whether, what prices caused equilibrium in all the various markets, and then tried to iterate that forward. And looking at a neoclassical could say, oh, look, we've gone past that. We do DSG, and now we're talking about optimizing over an infinite time horizon, and maybe we'll make it a finite for some, and we'll have, a couple of representative agents, yada, yada, yada. But what he was saying is fundamentally, you build everything up you go from micro to macro. You believe you've got to learn micro first and somehow aggregate to the macro level. You assume equilibrium is stable without questioning whether it is not stable. And frankly, the equilibrium of the DSG models are unstable, but they force stability on it. They log linearize, as it's known, and choose parameter values that are stable and talk about jumping across phase spaces without, I think, knowing they're talking about doing that in the first place. So it comes down to this fundamental paradigmatic foundations, individual orientation, add up from the individual, presume equilibrium is stable, and fundamentally model capitalism as a barter system. Okay, and also trivialize uncertainty about the future to make it comparable to risk. Now, anything that doesn't do that on a grand scale ends up being non-neoclassical. But what you'll find is they fiddle with stuff around the outside. So somebody will bring in a model with more than one agent, or somebody else will bring in a model where people don't use what's called an Euler equation to decide their consumption, et cetera, et cetera. And they'll fiddle, and every time you object, they say, oh, we've already covered that, this particular model. It's still built on that same fundamental, what I call Ptolemaic foundation. And they still tell students, well, you've got to learn that first. Yeah, there are other schools of thought. You can learn those after you graduate. And what happens is the type of schools that I'm involved in building atrophy, get no government funding, no research funding, and on the small of an oily rag, what we generate is criticised because it's not sophisticated enough when we actually get a debate like the one we had yesterday.
Another critique of your point of view, I think that the views that both of you have been sharing is that this new theory of economics stems from political dissent. It has to do with anti-capitalism, it has to do with anti-globalism, it has to do with the anger that was created by the collapse of the system, and that this is sort of an inherent weakness in the theory that it's too political. And Professor Moene, do you think that also?
No, I don't think so at all. I think you should just be more modest. When I come into the debate with you, I looked into the book. I'm quite sure you haven't looked into anything I've written.
Oh, sorry?
No, you haven't looked into anything I've written. But I looked into your book before I came here. I think this is just because they know the day are like that, and we others are sort of, you don't have to do investigation to see what it is.
I thought you were getting your knuckle dusted out.
You wanted a book?
Thanks. That wasn't what I said. I said that when I came here, I looked into the book on the library in Oslo, Debunking book, and I said that this is the asymmetry. I think there's an asymmetry between people are so certain about things that they don't have to check. And I think there's a lot of critique among economists, and what is here called the neoclassical economists as a sort of coherent group Here's the tactics of criticizing them. That is, you pick certain very specific and stupid things that some neoclassical economists sometime believed in. And then you use that name, and then you say that all others that disagree with you, they are in this sack of people where they could call it neoclassical.
The basket of deplorables.
So that means 80 and 90% of the economists, as I see them, they are vastly different. They are, for example, behavioral economists like him. They work with small, I would say, small moderation on, but important, very important moderations of an old set of returning basically to, for example, things that you can find in Moral Sentiments by Adam Smith, written in 1759 or published in 1759. So they're returning to taking up old, being inspired more by psychology and so on. That's extremely important and valuable. But they can communicate. It's a science in the normal sense. I don't mean science in the serious sense, but it's interdisciplinary discussions. That it's healthy, it's fine, and it's progress in it. You can't. You never expect progress when you sort of establishing a new system, which everybody that disagree with you, they're basically stupid. I think that is the worst tactics of.
So I guess you're saying that you can have both. You can have, and so you don't accept the premise that you have to choose between one model or the other.
Of course, you have to. But you don't have. As I said many times earlier, this conference, that Mao Zedong had many stupid citation, but here's one very good, and that is you have to sing different songs on different mountaintops. And I think that is a very good citation. You have to have different approaches to different problems. If you're going to study like he studies in his dissertation, if you're going to study educational choices and how that affects by the income of the parents, social group, and things like that, very important questions. Really important for reproduction of class and whatever, what term you will call it. If you're going to do that, you have a different approach. If you're going to study financial markets, you don't necessarily, because people can be very different for the different choices they make. It's not illogical or inconsistent at all. When I choose friends, I don't choose friends in the same way as I choose a car. I don't. I have very different things I care about, and I don't have a car. So, and I have many friends.
You won't ask the obvious question. Your turn.
I think we have established that you are in disagreement on this, but I think we can possibly, utilize that disagreement in discussing the other topic of tonight, which is debt and the debt situation.
But it doesn't follow that we disagree on that. That's my main point. That it doesn't follow. We disagree on something. For example, the tactics of criticizing economics. We disagree on that, but we can be complete agreement about the role of debt, the role of corruption in debt formation in many countries, the role of private debt, public debt, that we can have different approaches and understand it very similarly.
Let's find out. Professor Keene, when you think about the debt situation in the world globally, what do you see?
The biggest level of debt in private debt in human history. And we're in the middle of a debt bubble, which people will look back and see, why the earth didn't we see it coming? Why don't they know the situation they're in? And this has happened because mainstream economics teaches you don't need to worry about the level of private debt. And a decade after the crisis, you can read people like Joe Stiglitz and Paul Krugman on the topic, and they always disparage any attention to aggregate debt because they say anybody who worries about aggregate debt doesn't understand one person's assets and not a liability, and they cancel each other out except under special circumstances, and therefore they don't worry about the level of aggregate debt. To me, my foundation leads to saying aggregate debt is a crucial part of the system. If it gets too high, you'll have a breakdown. And what we've ended up with by ignoring that and actually encouraging private debt, which is a large part of conventional theory has done that as well, with what's called the Modigliani-Miller theorem, that the best situation for a firm paying interest on its debt, which it can tax deductors to have 100% debt finance, zero equity, That's all softened up the world to accept a level of private debt which is greater than we had during the Great Depression and greater than anything in the recorded history of capitalism. And so we've been led into a blind alley, a trap, by people who don't know we're leading us into one.
Cahal, what do you think?
I mean, that's not really my area of expertise, to be honest. So
But you're a behavioural.
I am a behavioural economist. Yeah. You want me to use behavioural economics to comment on it? Well, I mean,
it's people, right?
It's
people are
right?
taking
Yeah,
out
exactly.
all these mortgages, right?
And I think one of the dominant theories that was behind a lot of deregulation. Now, I'm not saying all mainstream economists believe this, but it was the efficient markets hypothesis, which basically says that markets are, on average, process information correctly. And there was no real accounting for optimism and pessimism, and there was no real possibility of bubbles. And this was the intellectual rationale behind deregulating the financial market. But I think people like Hyman Minsky, who came up with theories about how investors can get overconfident and how a sort of a calm time can become a speculative bubble as they slowly become more confident as their investments pay off, really drew from irrationality. And that, you know, that was being...
not really irrationality, but
well, it's
uncertainty.
Not, uncertainty,
but
yes.
Uncertainty.
Well, that's the point. People can't be rational in the strict sense because the world is too uncertain. So they have to use rules of thumb and they have to copy what their neighbours are doing. I mean, that goes back to Keynes and the general theory. I mean, there was a good quote in Professor Keene's book, Ben Bernanke in 2000, who went on to become the chair of the Federal Reserve, obviously, but he actually dismissed Hyman Minsky and also Charles Kindleberger.
And this is partly what I'm talking about, a paradigmatic clash, because what happens is, you know, it completely sincerely, in the belief that they're having a huge debate, they're debating every topic between A and B. Mainstream economics ignores anything that lies outside that range. And this is Ben Bernanke, so this is, you know, not somebody who's minor importance or minor significance. This is him on Hyman Minsky in 2000. Hyman Minsky and Charles Kindleberger have in several places argued for the inherent instability of the financial system, but in doing so have had to depart from the assumption of rational economic behaviour. That's it in the text of the book. He then has a footnote: I do not deny the possible importance of irrationality in economic life. However, it seems to me the best research strategy is to push the rationality postulate as far as it will go. That's the end of his consideration of Minsky. And since the crisis, there have been bastardised attempts to bring Minsky in, but Minsky's an independent paradigm, and they cannot bring it in without abandoning the core, and what they do is a caricature.
I sat on a different stage with Professor Keene yesterday, and he listed countries that he is certain are sitting on top of a big bubble waiting to burst. One of those countries, he says, is Norway. It has to do with the property prices in Norway and the accumulation of private debt. Do you think so too?
It must be much more specific than that. For example, many people think that there's a housing bubble in Oslo. I think there's usually rising asset prices or housing prices in Oslo, basically. I think it's really dangerous. But it is a bubble. I am not so convinced. I think it is an inflow of people to Oslo that drives prices. It's equally bad. Also in that case, it's not only bubbles that are bad. It means that after a while, and I think that's the most socially interesting thing, those who do the work in the city cannot live in the city. They're only those who own the restaurants where they work, or those who own different houses and inherit houses. These are the things that I think is very interesting to study. I think also it's very interesting to study the interplay with people who are rationed in the credit market. Most people are in that situation that they borrow up to what they can borrow, given the asset value, the value of the house that they're going to borrow to. When you increase the price, then you can also borrow more, because then it seems as if you have some more security you go to the bank, there's more security because the prices went up for houses in Oslo. And then you can borrow more, and you can actually, in many cases, you can have sort of a rising price or houses generate higher demand for houses simply because it multiplies up in the credit market, that you can borrow more and you can sort of invest more in houses. And we see this, that people have been constrained in this way, and when prices go up, you should think that then demand should go down, but it goes up even more. And this is, I think, is really a dangerous thing. Whether you call this a bubble or not, I'm not quite certain whether that really fits the picture. Where I learned this is from the neoclassical economist Knut Wicksell, a socialist. He was very prominent scholar in Sweden. Wrote he's dead more than 100 years ago, so it's not somebody who taught it into my ear. But this is the. I'm just going to say that I came from a department. When I was a student at that department, these things were taught. Ragnar Frisch was very obsessed by the sort of the role of debt. They came from the experience of the 30s, where there were debt crises all over the place, and they taught that to the students all over the place after the war. So this lesson that they never taught about aggregate debt, at least it doesn't fit my experience. Maybe it would fit, that was what they did in England, or I don't know. They didn't do that in Oslo, and it doesn't fit at all. Povelmo, I was extremely careful in sort of studying the interaction between the flow of new credit and the sort of the total debt in the economy. Studying this in different types of models, and very gave advice to the Norwegian government about debt issues. So it doesn't really fit my experience, but maybe Norway is a special case. But this is how I see it.
I might have, not been paying attention, but I have the impression, at least, that many economists these days seem to be very worried about public debt, but not so worried about private. Is this correct, or is it wrong?
I think they are concerned with both, but public debt, of course, that is for both for private and public debt. There is some sustainability principles, in the sense that it depends on how, for public debt, it depends how much you can tax, how much you can sort of serving the debt, and it depends on what the interest rates are, and it depends on the economic growth rate in the economy. And then you can calculate what is the sort of the amount of debt that is sustainable, say public debt. And most countries are actually beyond that. And that's very interesting. Take a country like Venezuela. I think both the national debt, the public debt, is extremely high in the country, and they have the world's highest oil reserve, and they have no assets at all.
They have the highest reserves per capita.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Highest. I think the absolute amount per country they have the highest reserve.
More than Saudi Arabia.
Yes, I think they're the largest oil reserves in the world per country. I think that's right.
Wow. Professor Keane.
I think it's just an illustration of how you can really mismanage an economy. You have these assets, oil in the ground, and you run up into there's a huge crisis. The crisis in Venezuela today is bigger than the crisis in the US in 1929.
Professor Keane, what is your take on private debt contra public debt?
Public debt is, the government's the only institution that owns its own bank. If you owned your own bank and you're in debt to yourself, would you be worried?
No.
If you debt to somebody else and they accept your money as payment of the debt, would you be worried? If you could service it by simply adding elements to your assets and liabilities, would you be worried? That's the real world in that sense. The real worries are what you do with that capacity. If you then go out and buy, a beer for everybody in Stavanger, you might drive up the price of beer, cause shortages, etc., etc. It's the practical impact of what you do with that capacity that's the real worry. Now, private debt is ignored, except as something as seen, is it sustainable? That's the question which mainstream economists tend to ask. My perspective, and I've done this in mathematical analysis as well, is that total demand in the economy is not just the turnover of existing money. It's the turnover of existing money plus credit, which is created by new debt. Now, when you get your demand becoming dependent upon the level of credit in your economy, then you can have an enormous part of your demand which can disappear overnight if banks stop lending, if people stop borrowing. So rather than it being sustainable at a particular level, to keep the rate of growth you're used to, that growth rate of debt's got to continue as well. Now, in Norway's case, just after the global financial crisis, the rate of growth of credit in 1 year was 35% of GDP. And then it fell to minus 6%. So I think you had a bit of a crisis between 2009 and 2011. And I can pick this sort of stuff because I look at the effect of aggregate debt, but and change in that debt. Now, because it's ignored by the mainstream, you can have a discussion like we've just had, and it's all about the sustainability of the level. If that was the only issue, I wouldn't be worrying about it. It's the fact you become relied upon credit demand. And this is one of the indications of a different paradigm.
I think this is an example of a polemical style of discussion. I just said the same thing as you said, that when the banks increase the borrowing to people, then prices for houses go up, and the banks feel secure, and then people can borrow more, so because the asset value is very high.
I agree totally with that.
Yeah,
I agree totally with that. You can tell me to shut up, but I do agree with you.
Okay, but I just think that this is a common knowledge, and as I said, this was known by Knut Wicksell 100 years ago. It was very much prominent in the discussion in the 30s. It is also standard tools and understandings of the instability of credit market, and that's also been the reason why Norway, for a long, long time, discussing these things, had regulated credit markets. Why they were very careful in sort of regulating banks, and why people for example, in my department, were very interested in this, to see sort of modeling banks into macroeconomic models. I think that's what also Stephen Keen done. I think it's a very useful approach to do that. But he isn't the only person who's done this.
Oh, I've never said I'm the only.
But I think this has been common knowledge by many, and who these neoclassical guys are that don't understand these things, they must be very stupid, I have to admit.
Well, not stupid. They live in a paradigm that tells them it doesn't matter. And like, if you're quite right, if you go back and read Wicksell, if you read even Pigou actually produced graphs just like the ones that I produced on the relationship between change in private debt and the level of unemployment. And in his 1929 book, Economic Fluctuations. And Pigou was the main person that Keynes used as a rival. Yep. Okay, so I'm saying there was an understanding of some of this stuff, but it disappeared. Fisher got into it as well. Fisher was ignored on this particular front, and it's really the American mainstream. If I'm going to criticise anybody for being stupid, it's going to be American economists, because they drove all that understanding out over time, and consequently they were the ones who led the charge for deregulating the finance sector. They're the ones who told us that deregulating finance would produce a much more efficient and reduce risk. Look what happened. Now that's if you look at again, this is why paradigms matter, because the Minsky approach says you simply can't allow the private financial system to generate that much debt. You must be writing it off. You don't give creditors rights and oppress debtors. A whole range of very, very different policy recommendations come out of a different paradigm, and frankly the world would be a much better place if that other paradigm had been dominant, but it's not.
I'm sorry to say this, but we're running a bit short of time here. But I think we will arrange for a cage fighting event here around midnight, if that's all right with you.
Can we get one remark each in the end?
Yeah. You can, but I just wanted to say that if anybody we have probably time for 1 or 2 questions if you have any.
That's better.
So please just sing out, as we say in Norway. Nobody?
Yeah.
That means in clear text that China and Norway will not have any problems, or do they have multiple problems due to no public debt and high level of private debt?
Your major thing Norway's got in its favour is a huge trade surplus. And I think you've managed your oil extremely well, by the way, and the extent to the industrialisation you've done in the oil is a tribute to your country. But the government debt is not a problem because you've paid it down so much for that huge trade surplus. What you've allowed happen in the meantime is your level of private debt has risen from the low level. If we go back to the 1960s, 120% of GDP, it's now 240% of GDP. And that's a large part of where that housing bubble, and I'm quite happy to call it a bubble, has come from, in not just Oslo, the whole of Norway. So by ignoring private debt, and this again is something which, if you're trained as a neoclassical economist, private debt is not something you put down on your worry list. And therefore you ignore data which shows an enormous increase in private debt over time. So government debt isn't a problem, but you've got a very low level of it. And you have a high trade surplus, which is your main buffer to problems that can come out of that anyway. It's countries which have a trade deficit get restrictions on running a government deficit because they have to basically borrow money from overseas to cover their imports, and their currency can collapse. Yours isn't going to do that. But government debt's not the problem. You haven't got much of it, but you've got a large amount of private debt, and you're reaching levels which are close to the highest that's ever been reached by a national economy. The record holder, I think, is not Belgium, Denmark, with 280% of GDP. You're at 240%.
I'm getting this signal now from...
Okay.
So, 2 minutes. Professor Moene, would you also like to comment on that?
No, I think it was a good...
So we have time for one more question, please.
Right.
I have a question for you. You predicted the last financial crisis in 2008-9, and what do you think about the next crisis? When is that coming? Do you have a new prediction?
The next 3 years, and it won't be in the countries that had a crisis beforehand. It'll be those who managed to avoid it by borrowing their way through it. On that front, Norway is one of those countries, but because it's gone from, at the time of the global financial crisis, 180% of GDP, this private debt level now 240%. So you've added 60% of GDP worth of debt in the last 8 years, 10 years. And there's other countries that are in the same sort of boat, China being the biggest, but then there's, in order of size, South Korea, Canada, Australia, Belgium, Norway, Sweden, and a few other countries that are going to have a crisis over the next 3 years.
Either of them or all? All? Or one of them or all of them?
All of them.
Within 3 years, all of them going to have a crisis?
1 to 3 years, yeah.
And on that note, it's time to wrap up. Panic. Now would be a good time to panic. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Have a nice festival. Go to your different places.